Ok, perfecto. Pues quiero decir gracias por la oportunidad para hablar aquí, pero lo siento, voy a hablar en inglés. Pero después de mi charla, si tienes preguntas, por favor, háblame. Siempre quiero saber más de tu país, de tu vida, so háblame si tienes preguntas o lo que sea, ¿ok? Perfecto. Ok, vamos a empezar. Okay. So, hi. Today, the talk that I'm going to be focusing on, it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek name. Your model is biased, but so is your data. The case for ethics in data science. By the way, the URL there has a link to the slides, and I will share them on Twitter. And yes, that is my Twitter handle. It's pretty long, but I'm pretty active on it, and if you have questions, you can also reach me there. Okay. And let's go. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the obvious question, the elephant in the room, so to speak. Why should data scientists worry about ethics? Well, one thing I can tell you, think about this number, 2.5 billion gigabytes of new data is generated daily. That is an insane volume, and that's the most recent stat I could find from 2012. Here's some examples of headlines that are happening around the world right now. So for example, we've got at the top, this is talking about a data leak in the 2016 United States presidential campaign. Essentially, there was approximately 200 million records that were exposed and vulnerable for predicting voting behaviors during this campaign. That data leak is insane. Additionally, there was also, under the Trump campaign, an unprotected AWS server that had something like 50 million records just kind of hanging out that anyone could access. Again, like no auth required. So we've got data leakages in our political system, and for the United States, the 2016 campaign was obviously a very big political issue for our country. Additionally, you see data science kind of coming to play into other areas. So in 2012, there was an incident where essentially a teenage young woman was browsing Target, and based on her shopping behavior and products she was looking at, Target was able to understand and think, oh, we think this person might be pregnant, and started targeting her with emails on an email account that she shared with her father. Long story short, the father didn't know she was pregnant. Things are complicated. Additionally, we see time and again with the rideshare economy or just the share economy, the danger when we start giving permission to our data and we don't know what people are using it for and how. And as I kind of alluded to, the 2016 presidential election in the United States was really data-driven. So we've got a lot of kind of snippets here happening where we think about how data is being consumed and how there's problems around it. So as I said, I do want to again thank you all for inviting me to come speak. And part of the reason is because I'm from Chicago. This is happening like last night through today. I don't want to be there. So I'm super excited to not be in the snow. And I have no idea how bad it's going to be through the weekend. But I will say Chicago's pretty cool in the summer. Come visit. Both Naomi and I are from Chicago. We love it. We would love to talk with you. But a little bit about why I care about this topic and who am I. So, Lorena Mesa. I actually started my career not in computer science. Not as a programmer. I do not have a degree in that. In fact, my degree is in mathematics and political science. So as a Chicago resident and a very bright-eyed, bushy-tailed student, I was very, very inspired by the 2008 presidential election, specifically that President Obama was running. I'll talk a little about that in a moment. But from that campaign kind of going forward, I really start to see the way that you can have data science applied in various spaces that aren't explicitly tied to computer science, or maybe even what we might call the hard sciences. Since then, I've done a lot of work with the Python Software Foundation. I'm a director. I run the PyLadies Chicago chapter. I do a lot of work with Django Girls, and I work at a company in Chicago called Sprout Social. And we are a social media management analytics tool, and I sit on the data science team. So I kind of do a little bit of software engineering and a little bit of modeling work. So as I alluded to, the 2008 campaign for me was a very eye-opening experience. Essentially, this was the first campaign that really started to use what we might call big data in a very different way and revolutionized the way that we saw political campaigns in the United States function. So what exactly does that mean? Some ways you can think about it was the use of social media. Remember, this is a very young platform. I like to remind people, so I was part of the population that got onto Facebook when you still had to require a university email address. And then that had been opening to more and more people. So that just kind of goes to show that the last 10 or so years have been really instrumental in the growth of social media. So that was really pivotal with this campaign. Additionally, we were getting data from all kinds of different sources that we didn't have access to before. So you might think, okay, we can go through the Democratic National Committee to get information. So GOTV stands for Get Out the Vote. So you can go and get like data lists from your political organization. But also, because we had social media, we can go do data mining. We can start kind of seeing what people were interested in, what brands people liked, what were people talking about, and really could engage with people in different ways with new data sets we didn't have before. So that led to what we might think about as the personalized campaign. So I like to think of it as the customize, insert blank for Obama. So I worked on the Latinos for Obama part of the campaign, but we had many, many interest groups. And because of our data that we had available and the scale of data we're working with, we were really able to customize our platform to understand what people's concerns were and where they were at. So the notion here kind of with the talk today, I'm going to kind of say a little bit about how I understand data science. I'm going to go a little bit into some case studies that, to me, highlight some of the ethical concerns that I've started to notice. And then I'm going to give you some notions of where I think we can do better to help us start thinking about ethics in our data practices and in the services that we build on top of the data that we consume. So when we say data science, what exactly does that mean? So I know we saw this Venn diagram last night in the great Keynote, so I'm glad that was referenced. And in fact, you can never, it's not a talk about data science if you don't have this Venn diagram in it. It's ridiculous. So top left, you have computer science. Top right, you have the math and stats. The bottom here, you have subject area expertise. So this might be someone with a PhD like in chemistry or in astrophysics. And then in the intersection is the unicorn who's supposed to be the data scientist. So who do you think, does anyone think that like this is actually what data scientists are? Probably not. We already had a good talk last night kind of framing and setting up a little bit that while this is something that's thrown out there, that's not exactly the reality. So yeah, this unicorn data scientist, I'm sorry to say, does not exist. So essentially one thing I did want to highlight though are these kind of other overlapping areas, which is the traditional research, the traditional software, and the machine learning. I'm really going to be emphasizing machine learning. So for me, maybe what I should say, it's not so much that your model is biased, but so is your data. The case for ethics in data science, maybe I should say the case for ethics in machine learning. So I'm going to be kind of taking a micro, more focused look at this. So as always, it's good to have definitions for us to understand what we're talking about and why we're coming to the definition we're at. So machine learning, it's one of those things where I think you can look up various articles and you'll find 1 to 2 definitions that are completely contrary to one another in the same article. So that is not very helpful, but something I would say here is you probably get a definition like this, maybe like on Wiki or some like Intro 101 definition. But the thing I want to highlight here is what we all know. Machine learning uses algorithms and makes predictions on data. Done, I'm gonna leave. No, I'm kidding. but algorithms and making predictions on data, that's the heart of what we talk about when we talk about machine learning. Another way to kind of frame this, and a construct I really like to use, so this comes from a publication by Tom Mitchell, a leading innovator at Carnegie Mellon, essentially introduces machine learning with this framework, saying a computer program is said to learn from experience E with respect to some task T and some performance measure P if its performance on T as measured by P improves with experience E. So your algorithm is going to be doing the task. You have to give it some data so that you can then start understanding this performance measurement. That's a really nice kind of framework for us to think about. Or to even get a little bit more concrete, when we say learning, like the learning in machine learning, well, how do humans learn? When we're learning, I can think of being a little kid and being really, really, really hungry and always like sticking my hands and everything on the stove. I had no patience and burning myself and being like, wow, that's really, really hot. So I started to recognize, hey, a red coil means hot. I'm not gonna touch that. I've learned something. I've got that memory. I've got that lived experience. Or as a little kid, the notion of running really, 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 really fast. Like I have a niece, she's really excited to run everywhere, and then inevitably when she falls, maybe she hasn't quite learned it yet, but inevitably when she falls, she associates pain with running too fast, and ideally, she's learning not to do that. So that's human learning, right? If we're talking about machine learning, think about if we were talking like finance. How are we going to make predictions on what the stock market is going to be tomorrow? Well, we don't have experience as lived memories. We have experience as the historical price point data. So, January 15th, how was the Apple stock doing? How was it doing January 16th? Also, what was the announcements that were coming out? What products are coming out? So we have notions around the actual historical data on the price point, and we might have other information about the current events that can allow us to understand how to forecast and make predictions on stock data, for example. So kind of thinking through this paradigm a little bit, let's go ahead and pivot into talking about social media. So as I said, this was kind of how I started getting into understanding the role of data science in the world around me. I use social quite a lot, and it's something that I think everyone here probably participates in. And where I work, we work with brands. So at Sprout Social, we essentially integrate with Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. And what we do is try to provide them a streamlined ability to communicate with their audience through social media. But some of the dangers with social media, I'm just gonna kind of let that linger there for a moment. Because this is a lot, right? These are all snippets of actual events that are happening in like the last year, 18 months. So we'll go into a little bit more detail with some of these. But some of the things that kind of pop out to me is we've got some monitoring or policing of social, like who gets to speak and who's censored. So censorship, there's something there happening. Meet the humans who protect your eyes. We'll deal into that, but there's something about content. There's the censorship, people being moderated, and those who do the moderation. So when we think about cyberbullying, it's important to understand that cyberbullying there's a few ways we can start thinking about what that means. Obviously, when I communicate with you in person, you can pick up on things that we might not be able to pick up on with social media. You might be able to hear my inclination, or if I'm speaking faster, or if I'm using body language. All these are cues that we can use to help arrive at the context. Unfortunately, with social media, we don't have things like that. So when we start thinking about how do we start writing an algorithm to understand communication in online spaces, we have to start thinking about it from different ways. What are the things that we can record, right? So people have started to point out the deliberate, repeated, and hostile behavior. So there's repetition, there's some notion of aggression there, and the idea of deliberate. How can we model what deliberate is? But when we talk about cyberbullying, these are some core concepts. Repetition, hostility are really core to your definitions. So with thinking about cyberbullying, there's quite a few ways we can ask this question with data science to help us start thinking about cyberbullying detection or moderation or things like that. So one thing we could do, maybe our task, back to that paradigm that Mitchell gave us, maybe the task is to identify the offender. So is the responding party a cyberbully, AKA a troll, if you've heard of that before? Or maybe our task at hand is to identify instances of cyberbullying, which would actually maybe be the email sent, the tweet sent, the Facebook post sent. So in that case, we can ask questions like, what is the likelihood a conversation is cyberbullying? To ask that question a little bit of a different way, is the conversation aggressive? So this notion of flaming is something that you might hear when you start looking into discourse around cyberbullying. Essentially, flaming is defined as sending angry, rude, or vulgar messages directed at a person privately or to an online group with the intention of starting a fight with the victim. Part of that definition also includes, you might hear things like doxing, leaking personal information, and that's when things start to get really scary. So the idea of a troll is someone who's kind of instead trying to be a little bit more picking on you, whereas flaming is a little bit more incendiary, hence the notion of flaming. So maybe this idea of sentiment analysis can help us think about understanding cyberbullying. And then just asking that question even a little differently. At what level is a conversation deemed cyberbullying? So this, I hope, gives you an idea of how complex it is to start modeling these really nuanced, complex human interactions. Back to that mention around content moderation. So one thing that we see quite a lot with content moderation is the idea of outsourcing. Who is doing it? So you might have, and by the way, in the slides, there's links to all of these articles, so you can go read at your own leisure. But there was a bit done by The Guardian looking at how the relationship with Facebook and their content moderation worked. Essentially having a very rigid definition of saying, cyberbullying is going to be equal to these three things, and if it doesn't have it, we don't define it as cyberbullying. If it does, we will define it as cyberbullying. But essentially, there's some kind of checklist that you have to make when you are moderating. So you might understand if you use Facebook or if you use any social, it might rely on content moderation via the user. So you might see something and say, oh, this is really nasty. I'm gonna go ahead and mark it as violent, or I'm gonna mark it as spam or something else like that. Once that thing is flagged, it can then come into the moderators. Also, the notion here of the content moderation via the product owner, there might be something, the product owner here might be like, maybe there's the in-house moderation team, maybe they are more actively combing through stuff themselves. So think about users coming in, sending stuff their way, or maybe the other side where it's actually an in-house team looking at it. But as you probably noticed when I start talking about that, is that this is a huge process that requires a lot of human input, right? Very complex. So you can imagine that this can get quite inefficient pretty quick, and it won't scale. So, if the idea here is, again, when we talk about cyberbullying, if it's this kind of idea that people are going through and they're looking at, a piece of content for 15 to 30 seconds, they're supposed to be going through this flow. Hey, is this thing aggressive or not? Yes, it is. No, it isn't. As you start labeling it, it's going to get fed back into your algorithm, and then you have some kind of performance measurement to say, hey, actually, is this correct or not? It might mean that you have cross-validation, so maybe a few people are monitoring the same content. Maybe there's some other in-house metrics you've adopted over time, but this is kind of the flow that we talk about with monitoring social media. You might have a flow kind of like this, where you have content coming in, stuff lives in this soup of AWS, maybe you use Lambda, which is serverless functions. It then gets shoved into a database somewhere, and then maybe you have some pandas on top, or whatever else you use in the scientific Python programming stack. But essentially, the idea here is, at some point, there's going to be human input, and that's the flow we went through with the task and the performance measurement. Now, you can imagine that this can get, as I said, it gets quite complex. So with cyberbullying, that kind of notion I was talking about, the stream of data coming in, when we're talking about data science, you might hear this term feature analysis or feature engineering, which was also something mentioned in the keynote last night. But this is where things get really complex. It's really important how you shape your data, because it's going to impact, well, first of all, what data you have, how did you get the data, and then how do you shape that data, because that's going to essentially be your input then for your algorithms, right? So the model selection triple, the data engineering is a huge component and is very instrumental in how these things operate in the wild. So with something like cyberbullying, without going too deep into it, but if you're doing some kind of text analysis, you might be doing some things like text normalization, removing stop words, removing special characters. And stop words, by the way, are words that don't really provide context. So the, of, but might be words that would get stripped out. And then also this kind of stemming technique, maybe the notion of gardener, garden, and gardener. Do you want to treat those all as the same instance of a word or not? You might be doing some of these kind of things. But one of the tricky things here with your feature optimization is once you start normalizing your text and you start manipulating it, you can lose context, right? So for example, if you have a sentence like, that is not the best, the not best could maybe suggest, if you're doing sentiment analysis, that not best, if you do what down here is called an n-gram, a bigram, looking at relationships of two words, if you strip out the not from it and you're only looking at best, you would think maybe that's communicating something positive. So when you start doing text analysis, you've got to be very mindful and critical of how you do this. Just to kind of just give you an example of how that looks in the Python stack, if you do TF-IDF vectorization, you might notice there the removing of stop words, you have your n-gram range, things like that. But you might be using this pipeline from sklearn, and again, there's a link there if you want to go ahead and click through and play with that yourself. But this is the key question I want to get to. So I've alluded to this now quite a few times, and I'm hoping you're kind of seeing a pattern here. No one human or computer can sift through all social media and online communication. So what happens when this is the reality of the world we live in? Who gets policed and who's the policer? And that's a really, really scary situation. So I kind of alluded that I would get back to this. So in the United States, around Hollywood, there was a big trending hashtag #MeToo, a lot of discussion around sexual assault in Hollywood. And Rose McGowan is an actress who spoke out about this, and when she was speaking about this in the sequence of her history of tweets, she had been talking explicitly about this Hollywood producer and mogul that everyone was calling out, but then very quickly thereafter, her account was suspended. And a lot of people on social media started getting really confused. So I've got the sequence here, and I know it's a big wall of text, so be patient with me. But if you notice here the Twitter safety, this is how they start explaining why her account got suspended. So here they say that it's temporarily locked because one of her tweets included a private phone number, which violates terms of services. So remember I was saying you might have this definition of cyberbullying, which includes the flaming, the idea of doxing information. So that couldn't fit within that definition. And then if you look at the other sequence here, it says, the tweet was removed, the account has been unlocked. But then the last thing here says, we really want to make sure that we can empower our users to be able to communicate, and we stand with the brave women and men who use Twitter to share their stories, and will work hard every day to improve our processes to protect those voices. So right here, this kind of starts getting at the complexity of what it means to do moderation. It was very confusing for the user in this instance to understand why their account was suspended. And when it comes to something as politically and socially charged as sexual assault, with such a global stage, people are going to ask questions, and there's going to be issues that arise. So the idea here, Twitter is not obviously the only candidate at play here. The kind of flow I talked about with you about thinking about cyberbullying, it is a very simplified approach. I can point you to some white papers if you want to read more about that. Just one thing I want to say is, even then, what model you make for one platform may not be generalizable to others. So for example, Reddit, it's an anonymous community, and they push moderation onto the subreddit. So these special interest forums, they push moderation onto that level. And even then, the various subreddits have different levels of moderation. Wikipedia, they have these Wikipedia talk pages. If you want to do some data diving yourself, there's a beautiful data set called the Wikipedia Detox Project, where they scraped, I think it's something like 50 billion records of data looking at the talk pages, which is essentially when you're a user, you can make articles on the website, and people can start reviewing your pages and start dialoguing with you about the things that you're suggesting and adding to Wikipedia. So that's a really good one, and does actually include information, demographic information about users. So, how do you understand cyberbullying in a community where you're anonymous? How do you understand it in a community where you're not? And then how do you understand it when you have Twitter, where there's varying levels of being anonymous or not? So it's really complex to think about this. And this gets back to kind of the failure that we struggle with, which is interpretability, interpreting the results. What is the cost of failing to identify cyberbullying? Do we care more about false positive or false negative? So the false positive here being that we label a piece of content as cyberbullying versus the false negative, where you mislabel something that is cyberbullying as innocent. So, what's the cost here, and what happens when we don't have a good mechanism to understand this? I just kind of wanted to throw this up here. If you look at these slides later, I kind of have been taking a more supervised approach to looking at how we might understand doing text analysis with cyberbullying. And there's a whole family of different algorithms that you can use with some high-level definitions here. You can read that on your own time, but if you do want to look at that, that's something that you can come back to. And then lastly, something also to remember, human languages are constantly evolving. We all know this. Python is a language that's constantly evolving. Use Python 3, not Python 2. So with our language, it's constantly updating. We're constantly introducing new things. So how do we even stay aware of what is aggressive, what isn't? With a trending hashtag, how do you know that something is talking about something really gross and is aggressive and is possibly exposing someone who's highly vulnerable on the internet? So the language changes. So cyberbullying, that's kind of the first thing. Communication. Modeling the problem is difficult and hard, and when you only have certain types of information, the question you can ask and how far you can go with that question presents challenges for us. So in thinking about another problem space where we might see some issues, we can look at TripAdvisor. So I know I use TripAdvisor. I'm guessing, at least I know I've seen TripAdvisor on a lot of institutions around here. I think even for the conference speakers at our hotel, it's like, TripAdvisor, we're good. But TripAdvisor recently got into some sticky situations when it came to reporting sexual harassment. So recently, in 2010, I believe is when this started, essentially, a woman had reported that she was violated at a resort in Mexico. And what had happened was she reported it on the actual TripAdvisor page, and then the content disappeared. And she did this more than once, as I understand it. But this is a common pattern, apparently, where people are reporting sexually aggressive instances happening at various properties, but then that feedback is removed, or as you see here, is closed as being off topic because it's not family friendly, whatever that means. So this is a big problem, right? Now we're seeing it as late as, I believe this is November this is coming from? Yes, this is coming from November, late 2017. TripAdvisor then started getting into some problems because if you are intentionally removing data and intentionally not labeling something, or you are using an incorrect label to understand a customer's concerns, that presents an ethics problem for us, right? At what point do we have ownership in escalating serious crimes to authorities, to maybe the people who own the hotel? If you're actually going back and literally rewriting the written record, that's a problem. So who has powers in that and who can do what? Because again, when you go and use TripAdvisor, they use a sorting algorithm based on reviews, based on your price point, based on various things to go ahead and give you recommendations on where to stay in a ranked order. So if you're actually censoring what information is available, is that ethical? I don't know. So where TripAdvisor kind of fell now with this is that they are going to, you'll notice that this theme kind of starting to emerge, saying that they're going to make a better effort to communicate when something violates their data policy, their privacy policy, and what they will do when they edit and they resubmit. So actually giving you a reason for saying, hey, we actually changed this, or we censored this review. They actually are claiming they will go a step further to be more transparent around that. Another thing that they're doing, I don't know if you can read this back there, but again, in the article, you can find this from the New York Times, there is this badge that will be shown on the website, and it will be there for up to 3 months, essentially saying, hey, like something recently happened and was reported here at this location, you should be aware of that. So kind of like an alert thing. So yeah, maybe there's steps towards improving this, but again, at what line where is our hand, where's the culpability for us as data practitioners, and how far do we go? This is yet another example. And then I will wrap the last discussion up with the idea of the sharing economy, which is a place I think we've seen a lot of issues, be it with transportation, be it with lodging, or other kinds of applications that exist in the share economy. So in this instance, this is actually with Airbnb, something I use all the time, and racial discrimination. So essentially in 2016, this hashtag started trending of Airbnb while black, how the hidden bias shapes the share economy. And essentially what had happened was that there was a person who was hosting a listing on their page, and they noticed that when they changed their name to Tina, they were able to get more people and more traffic coming and booking, and when they actually removed their photo showing who they are to a cityscape, they actually were getting more and more traffic coming in and more bookings on average coming in for their listings. In a white paper that kind of delves into this, essentially the idea here is, how are they positioning the listing and how do people understand where they want to list? There was essentially some discrimination happening here and was amplified by prior biases that people had. Essentially 16%, in an experiment on Airbnb, we found that applications from guests with distinctly African American names are 16% less likely to be accepted relative to identical guests with distinctly white names. So when you create a marketplace that is contingent on having a photo and having the name tied to it, at what point, again, do we have to think about how we are surfacing this data to go ahead and present and craft and manicure our online marketing spaces? So in this discussion, it was pretty apparent when they started looking at names and they started looking at how people were actually able to understand who they were leasing from, that there was some historical bias influencing how people book. So this all just kind of comes back to say, remember how I said machine learning is just algorithms and you're making predictions on data, essentially with the supervised learning approach? Well, yeah, algorithms. They are, essentially they're shaped by the data and the humans who make them. So what exactly does that mean? There's a few various speakers who kind of, I think, put this quite nicely. And Cynthia Dwork here kind of highlights the notion that when you think about discrimination, and when you think about discrimination in higher education, there's actually had been processes introduced within the United States at the collegiate level to prevent bias. So if we're doing that in other ways, and we're thinking about how bias exists in other ways, but we're increasingly using technology and we're using algorithms to make decisions for us, why aren't we then bringing that same critical lens to the algorithms we create and the tools that we make? Kathy O'Neill has an excellent book that kind of gives, in a very palatable format, an overview pretty focused on the United States on how data science really has been introducing some challenges for us as tool makers and as data practitioners. Essentially, the underlying algorithm is going to learn the bias that is in the data. So if we're collecting data that does not actually adequately represent the complex society around us, so back to the cyberbullying example, if we're not actually getting to observe the full pool of conversations that happen online, but we have to rely on user input, we're only scratching and observing part of the conversation that's happening, combined with the fact that our techniques that we have to use can remove context. Maybe the data that we have is inconsistent, isn't in the appropriate format, and we now have algorithms which are able to make decisions, and it's kind of a black box. We just trust these tools complicitly without us having to think about, well, why is it making that decision, and is that the correct decision? So this part that Kathy O'Neill writes that I think is really important is that algorithms tend to punish the poor and the oppressed in society while making the rich richer. What do I mean when I say that? Data science is a tool for the masses. We can't possibly, go and monitor the 44 billion messages that happen on social every day. There's just not enough humans, and there's not enough time, and maybe not enough computers. Our resources are finite, and they're fixed. So how can we do better? So if that's a tool for the masses, and if people with more wealth are able to say, no, I'm going to maybe commission a study, or I'm going to have some customized analysis for me, they might be able to have that dialogue with the people who are returning and giving back those results. So again, interpretability and who is the one making the decisions and for whom are those decisions made, those are really important questions. So I think all of these kind of case studies at a glance, they give us some questions that we consider when we are developing our tools, when we are exploring research questions, when we're doing whatever it is that we do with data daily. On the one side, we have collections. So how is our data being collected and or created? We have standards and methodologies, like how is the data even collected? We've got ethics, so this notion of restrictions. Data sharing and access, so how's the data shared and with whom? And then this is one I don't think we talk about enough, long-term maintenance. Now that we have the data, what happens next to it? Who comes to inherit it? And what do they do with that thing once they have it? I like to think about this as like the data I work with every day. It's kind of like this giant Lego bin, and it's everywhere. I don't know what the thing is measured, and I have to kind of figure out what this thing is. I have to really deep dive to get in there and be like, okay, so this definition of a thing changed over time. Does anyone have context about this? Maybe I find some code that has like a big to-do with like bug, nasty hack, come back fix, and it's from like 5 years ago. I mean, this is kind of the reality of the world we live in when it comes to being data explorers and data mungers, right? So I encourage you to maybe start thinking about your data practice like this. Think about your data lifecycle. What is your organization's policy and data management? So that means from the moment you create it, then you store it, then you use it, then you share it, then you store it somewhere, and ideally, you're destroying it at some point. So what does that data lifecycle look like for you? Within your organization, some ways you can start thinking about this. You can define a data ethics curriculum for your organization. You should be, I hope, talking about how you delete data. What are the mechanisms built into your software to remove things? Also, how are you educating your users about repurposing data? And then also, are you requiring consent for the collection of that? So it's actually, this is from a 2015 privacy management study, but essentially of the organizations polled, 17% said, only 17% of the organizations polled said they have a data map. Essentially a map saying like, here's where data comes from, here's definitions, here's the flow, here's where it lives, et cetera, et cetera. So an organization I really like and I think does this really well is Mozilla. If you go to their website, it's very clear. They have different categories for how they collect data. So what is technical data? What is interactive data? What is web activity data? So like for web activity data, you might have the web browsing history and info about the browsing history might be important because if the browser crashes, what was happening up to that moment. So they've got various categories, and they've also got a definition of their policies. So what happens when we actually collect data? Who's the steward of this data? What's the chain of command there? I think that this is the best example I've seen of this. I'm sure there's other groups that may do it better, but at the point I'm at, it is definitely something to consider. So the EFF also gives you an information around the privacy, around how does your data actually get used? So they say for testing, for defending against attacks on the site. So the notion of defining policies for how data is collected, what the data is being collected, and then also what they're going to use it for. These are ways you can start this dialogue within your own organization. And finally, something I think that's really important is the ability for people to know what data they have on you. One of the few places I've seen that has done this is Google. It's the Data Liberation Project. And essentially, you're able to go in and say, I want to download my data on various products. So they don't have everything supported, but they do have some of their products supported, including like Google Hangouts and Chrome, and some other groups. So it's still a work in process. And if you're curious, you can go check their blog spot to learn a little more. And if you are really interested in this conversation, there's one I really like called Abuse of an Algorithm Comes as No Surprise, which is really fascinating about more like HCI, human-computer interaction. But there's some white papers in there as well as some more palatable things. And lastly, if you don't know where to start with your data ethics, I'm going to tell you, look at this. This just happened February 6th. This is fantastic. So essentially, there's an effort that's getting started by various groups, and this was alluded to last night in last night's keynote, around this idea of trying to develop like our own data oath. So something akin to the medical practice with the Hippocratic Oath. Bloomberg, Bright Hive, and Data for Democracy are trying to champion this effort for community principles on ethical data sharing. So essentially having a data exchange that's collected ethically by the standards that are defined on the platform that you can find in the links here. And if you're curious about getting involved in this effort, because again, February 6th, they just started work on this and it's a really big push. And we want to hear your case stories. We want to know more. Go to Slack, talk to people, go to GitHub, add your data, add your problems, participate. And that's kind of it for me, y'all. Thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time with me. ¿Preguntas? ¿Sí? ¿No? ¿Alguien? Oh, Manuel, hola.
Hola, hola. Hola. Thanks for the talk. I really enjoyed. I want to know, I understood the importance of ethics on data science, but and I think that we are learning and improving the algorithm to decide if this is cyberbullying or not. But what happened in the meantime? I mean, what are we going to do with the people that is affected by this? It seems that we are just apologizing ourselves and doing just fixing the algorithm by learning. But what do you think that is the correct path to follow in that direction?
Perfect. So the question is, it's good to have these discussions, but is there something we can do more in the moment now? And I think, well, one of the things that I've noticed, I tend to go outside my organization to find the people that are passionate about this. And I'm noticing I'm doing a lot of work outside my professional space and not within my corporate organization. So I think there's a lot to be said about maybe finding the leader in your organization and bringing them to the data, to like the Data for Democracy group, for example. I think that additionally, and I'm not sure how this would be kind of internationally, what might be the groups that are more active here in Latin America or South America, but DJ Patil was the former chief data scientist under Obama, and he's been kind of going and building this collaboration between high-level corporations and actually getting buy-in. People are actually like giving money to this consortium to start talking about data ethics so that there can be a conference, so that there can actually be trainings and things like that. So maybe there's an opportunity if you have an organization that cares about this where you can maybe invest some money and try to bring that discussion to your corporate space. So I think that for me is a big thing. I notice I do a lot of work outside of work and I need to bring it back inside my four walls where I work. See?
Yes, hello, sorry. Thanks for the talk. I just wanted to ask you about the data cycle, lifetime cycle that you explained. You talked about deleting data. That is kind of a crime for me because it's very difficult to get. And now you're telling me that I should delete it. How are we supposed to approach this?
Yeah, that's a really great one. Obviously, depending on the sector you work in, like I work in social media, I obviously don't work with like healthcare data, right? And there's certain procedures in place where you have to hold on to records and there's certain compliance things you have to think about. So one of the things I guess for your given sector, I would try to understand what are the legal ramifications. Ideally, if you have an in-house legal counsel, or I know within the Python community, there are some people who specialize in intellectual property that you can start to begin that dialogue with around, around the data lifecycle. We want to be more progressive on this. So what kind of liabilities would I expose myself to? I think that would be somewhere where I would start.
Hello. Hi, Lorena. Thanks for the talk. My question is related. What are your views on how should we deal with data literacy? With like nowadays, a lot of people. Let's say a lot of people in this conference are aware of how they can manage their data or have an idea or how they should post or not post things. But how can we teach people in the outside world, and especially
Yeah,
younger
yeah.
generations that are entering technology without barriers
Definitely.
and posting about everything?
Yeah, yeah. On the one hand, I would say education in data science is obviously both the keynote last night and today. This is a field that has had rapid growth and is changing very quickly. So I know that at least within the United States, there's an effort to get universities to actually bring ethics into the data science training. So starting kind of with the next generation and saying, it's non-negotiable, we have to introduce this. But as kind of a backfill, one way in Chicago that I've been doing this, I'm pretty active with our civic tech community, working with nonprofits, so that I can start understanding when it comes to technology for nonprofits, what are the challenges they're facing, so I can actually not hypothesize what the data issues are, but actually learn from someone in the field doing these kind of things. So I think there's opportunity there as well. And the last thing, which just kind of escaped my mind. Oh, so the Electronic Frontier Foundation, they actually do these cool things called crypto parties, which kind of, if, like, for example, maybe you want to understand if you're vulnerable to to being doxxed or something. They essentially have like a workshop all written that you can run in your own communities that talks to you about like what are good tools to use for private encrypted end-to-end communication, what kind of security protocol should you be making to protect yourself. So I thought that was kind of a really interesting way to help you start thinking about, well, what kind of legal gray print should I be reading? What kind of practices should I start adopting? And then what technologies actually like in the community accepted as a good practitioner? So I think the EFF has some really good ideas around that too.
Hi. First of all, sometimes we develop machine learning that we give an input, and when the output gets out, some people may call it or label it as racist, but not because we model in that way, but because of the input we give it,
Right.
we got this like racist output. So what will be more ethic? Have an accurate and racist machine learning, or have more an inaccurate but more like inclusive output?
Yeah. So I understand the question is sometimes we don't understand the unintended consequences of the machine learning that we produce, right? So there might be content that's returned that actually is insensitive or represents some bias. So one way I like to think about this, so in my hometown, Chicago, where I'm from, it's kind of a classic city that has a lot of segregation. If you look at the real estate market, there was a practice in the 1950s called redlining, essentially where banks went and they drew a red line through various communities saying these areas that had a more ethnic diversity and lower socioeconomic incomes, they basically said these areas won't qualify for a home loan. And because they don't qualify for a home loan, this population kind of gets stuck into not getting the wealth that comes with owning a home. When people look at like real estate, they might think, okay, if I work at Zillow, I want to use the zip code. So zip code is a 5-number sequence to kind of represent a geographic area. They'll say, okay, well, the zip code is going to tell me something about the price of average home, the size of an average home, demographics of that area. Okay, maybe you can get that from the zip code, but if you don't know about the historical context maybe of Chicago and this intentional process that actually led to more racial inequality, that can be a problem if you're using a zip code to be a stand-in for wealth and for demographic information. So that whole example here of kind of talking about, how do I question what data to actually bring in? That, I think, is the level of granularity that we need to apply to our data when we're doing data feature and engineering. We need to actually understand where the holes are. I understand we won't always know that, and we're going to have an ongoing dialogue, but that kind of notion around who do you include in the dialogue, who is your user, can you understand what the product is that you're building for the end user? These are the kind of things I think we need to bring more into our practices. Additionally, I had one more thought. Additionally, with bias in general, I think the thing too that we have to start learning is just because we have a data set available for us to use does not mean we should use it. Just because you can get a quick buck, I'm hoping we're going to start elevating ourselves to a place where we don't make the easy choice. Just because you can collect data in a certain way does not mean that's the right way to do it. So I think there's something about us continuing to learn and have a dialogue, but also learning to make those hard decisions and say, no, we have principles upon which we stand. So I think it's going to be a combination of those two.
Yeah, so within the context of cyberbullying and overall online behavior, how do you think our Python community stands, and how does it compare to another tech communities?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. So the question was kind of, as technologists, are we thinking about problems that might arise from the technology we create with Python differently than other spaces? I wouldn't say that we think about it differently, but I would say because we have a very robust scientific programming community, that there's a lot of ability to have dialogues with people that might normally be siloed. So I always encourage people, when you're here, go talk with folks, because you're going to get people from all different disciplines and backgrounds. And I think that actually leads us to questions that we wouldn't otherwise have. But how that compares with other spaces, I can't say I've experienced it any differently per se. Okay, perfecto. Okay, adios.